On the night of 10 of February 1897, inside the old Waldorf-Astoria Hotel on Fifth Avenue, a woman in white kid gloves paused beneath a row of electric chandeliers. In a borrowed Versailles of silk-draped walls and potted palms, Cornelia Bradley-Martin adjusted a single white rose in a massive floral pyramid, the kind that cost more than a clerk's yearly wage. Outside, carriages rattled on the cold pavements. Inside, the marble floors flushed with velvet trains and armour costumes for what the press would call the most extravagant ball of the age. A reporter from the New York World would later describe such hotel splendor as a home for the incurably opulent, turning a night's decor into a social diagnosis. At the flower-laden buffet tables, dollar princesses and their mothers rehearsed a new idea: that a hotel could be a palace if only one ordered enough gilt chairs, orchestra stands, and roses. Yet the ballroom doors also framed something narrower, an architecture of expectation that could not be checked with one's cloak. When the last guests climbed into their carriages toward dawn, the flowers remained, already beginning to wilt. The bill that followed would cost more than money. On that cold February evening in 1897 at the Waldorf-Astoria Hotel, the Bradley-Martin ball transformed a commercial establishment into a temporary court that newspapers would discuss for decades. Cornelia Bradley-Martin, the American-born hostess whose husband had made his fortune in banking and land speculation, instructed florists and hotel staff with the meticulous precision of a theatrical director, transforming the hotel's public ballrooms and dining rooms into elaborate replicas of Versailles and Fontainebleau. The preparations had consumed weeks, architects installing temporary walls and decorative panels, florists arranging thousands of roses and orchids in massive pyramids and garlands, costume makers working overtime to outfit the approximately 200 guests in historically accurate reproductions of court dress from various European monarchies. Surviving guest lists and costume descriptions, preserved in society columns and private letters, show American heiresses arriving as Marie Antoinette in panniers and powdered wigs, as Elizabeth de Rothschild in ruffs and jeweled bodices, and as various other queens and empresses, each identity stitched in silk and Worth embroidery, accessorized with family jewels or pieces borrowed from jewelers who understood the publicity value of such display. The hotel's usual commercial character, its restaurant serving businessmen, its lobby accommodating travelers, was completely effaced for the night, replaced by a fantasy of aristocratic Europe transplanted to New York's Gilded Age. The sensory experience was overwhelming. The scent of thousands of hothouse flowers mixing with perfume and candle wax, the rustle of silk and satin as guests moved through the transformed spaces, the warmth of bodies and lights, creating a microclimate that contrasted sharply with the February cold outside. The electric chandeliers, still a relatively new technology in 1897, blazed with a brilliance that gaslighting could never match, creating an almost theatrical intensity of illumination that made jewels sparkle and costumes shimmer. Society pages the next day printed columns of breathless detail, reproducing menus that featured delicacies like terrapin and champagne, cataloging jewels worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, estimating the cost of the orchids. Some reports suggested $10,000 just for flowers, an astronomical sum. Cornelia Bradley-Martin had achieved exactly what she intended. The ball was the sensation of the season, discussed in every drawing room, analyzed in every society column, envied by those not invited. But within days, the mood shifted dramatically. Editorial pages condemned the monstrous extravagance of spending such fortunes. Estimates ranged from $200,000 to $370,000 for a single evening, in a city still marked by the economic devastation of the Panic of 1893, where thousands remained unemployed and poverty was visible on every street corner beyond the gilded neighborhoods of the wealthy. Critics pointed out the obscenity of spending on one night's entertainment, which would support a working-class family for multiple lifetimes. The contrast between the ball's excess and the city's suffering became a flashpoint for populist anger and progressive criticism of Gilded Age inequality. The hotel had offered what appeared to be a neutral stage, a commercial space that could be rented by anyone with sufficient funds. But the public reaction demonstrated that such neutrality was illusory. The Waldorf-Astoria was located in the city, visible to all, and what happened within its walls was subject to public judgment. The Bradley-Martins, stung by the criticism and facing increased property taxes that some attributed to resentment over their extravagance, eventually decamped to England, becoming permanent expatriates. The ball proved that a hotel could imitate a palace for one night, that commercial space could be temporarily transformed through sufficient expenditure of money and effort, but it also proved that the city would not easily forgive such displays. That public space, even nominally private, rented space, carried obligations and exposed its occupants to scrutiny and judgment in ways that truly private estates did not. The next experiment in using hotels as palaces would be quieter, more sustained, not a single spectacular ball, but lives lived permanently upstairs, year after year, in suites that blurred the line between residence and rental. By the late 1890s, the stretch of Fifth Avenue between 33rd and 34th Streets had become virtually an Astor fiefdom, a physical manifestation of one family's dominance over New York real estate and society. William Waldorf Astor and his cousin John Jacob Astor IV used the adjoining Waldorf and Astoria hotels as both lucrative investment and potent symbol, extending their family's domestic grandeur, already expressed in multiple mansions, into a new public commercial form that would reshape how wealthy Americans understood urban living. The Waldorf opened first in 1893 on the site of William Waldorf Astor's demolished mansion, a deliberate gesture meant partly to spite his Aunt Caroline Astor, who still lived next door. When she eventually surrendered and moved uptown, her mansion site became the Astoria Hotel, which opened in 1897 and connected to the Waldorf through a corridor called Peacock Alley, creating one of the world's largest and most luxurious hotels. The combined Waldorf-Astoria set new standards for hotel luxury and social prestige, becoming not just a place to stay temporarily, but a permanent address for some of New York's wealthiest families. Architectural drawings and hotel prospectuses from the period, preserved in archives, promised all the comforts of a private mansion with the convenience of a first-class hotel, explicitly marketing a hybrid form that would come to be called the apartment hotel or residential hotel. The pitch was compelling. Families could enjoy spacious, well-appointed quarters without the burden of managing a large household staff, maintaining a building, dealing with coal deliveries and roof repairs and all the other complexities of owning a substantial private residence. Hotel ledgers and registration records, where they survive, preserve the emerging pattern. Suites rented not by the night or week, but by the month, the season, or the year. Families bring furniture from their townhouses to personalize hotel suites, supplementing the hotel's standard furnishings with personal pieces that transform anonymous rooms into something more intimate. Private dining rooms reserved not for single events but standing orders, used repeatedly by the same families. Hotel directories listing long-term residents much as they would occupants of an apartment house, rather than transient guests. Behind the polished brass key racks and the marble-floored lobbies, a subtle but significant shift was occurring in how elite families, particularly wealthy women, organized their domestic lives. For widows, the hotel offered an especially attractive option. They could maintain a dignified, even luxurious lifestyle without the overwhelming responsibility of managing a large house and staff alone. For heiresses between marriages or seasons, the hotel provided flexibility, the ability to establish a respectable address quickly without long-term commitment. The hotel corridor began to replace the townhouse staircase as the site of certain kinds of domestic ritual. Calling cards were left with hotel desk clerks rather than footmen. Tea was taken in private hotel parlors or in public spaces like the Palm Court. Children were raised in hotel suites, though the wealthiest families typically maintained country houses or Newport. Cottages for summer residents, using the hotel primarily during the New York social season. The sensory environment differed from that of private houses in subtle ways. Hotel corridors carried the muted sounds of other residents, the soft footfalls of chambermaids and waiters, the distant clatter of service elevators. The smell was distinctively hotel, a mixture of fresh flowers, replaced daily, furniture polish, the faint institutional smell of commercial laundry, and the cooking odors that occasionally escaped from service areas despite elaborate ventilation systems. The light came through windows that looked onto city streets or inner courtyards rather than private gardens, a constant reminder that one lived surrounded by urban density rather than in aristocratic isolation. The Astors built hotels to rival their own houses, demonstrating through architecture and service that commercial hospitality could equal private domestic arrangements, and in doing so taught other wealthy families that one could live in palace-like splendor without owning the palace's stone. The implications would become clear over the next decades as the apartment hotel model spread, as more families adopted this hybrid form, and as the line between residence and hotel blurred almost to invisibility. When the next great hotel opened beside Central Park in 1907, American heiresses would test this promise to its limit, attempting to create not just comfortable residence, but dynastic headquarters in rented rooms. On 1st October 1907, the new Plaza Hotel opened at the southeast corner of Central Park on Fifth Avenue at 59th Street, a French Renaissance chateau rising 18 stories above the autumn trees and the carriage traffic circulating around the park. Designed by Henry Janeway Hardenberg, who had also designed the original Waldorf-Astoria, the plaza represented the culmination of the apartment hotel concept, purpose-built from the start to serve long-term residents as much as transient guests. Within weeks of opening, contemporary estimates suggested that approximately 90% of its units were occupied by long-term residents, wealthy families who treated their plaza suites as permanent addresses, receiving mail there, registering to vote from that address, listing it in social directories alongside or instead of country estates and Newport cottages. The building itself made architectural arguments about the relationship between hotel and home. Its exterior referenced European palace architecture, the mansard roofs, the ornate stonework, the scale that announced importance and permanence. The interior spaces were carefully zoned, lavish public rooms, ballrooms, dining rooms, the palm court, designed for entertainment and display, and private residential floors with suites that could be customized and combined to create apartments rivaling the scale of townhouses. The mechanical systems were state-of-the-art. Electric elevators, central heating, modern, plumbing, telephone connections to every room. A level of technological sophistication that even the newest private houses struggled to match. In January 1908, just months after the hotel opened, crowds gathered in the Palm Court to watch Gladys Vanderbilt, daughter of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, one of the wealthiest men in America, take afternoon tea under the glass ceiling with her fiancé, Hungarian Count Laszlo Széchenyi. The event was both private, a couple having tea, and performative, staged for society's observation. Taking place in a space that was simultaneously public, the Palm Court was open to hotel guests and visitors, and exclusive, not everyone could secure a good table, and the Vanderbilt presence made the space temporarily theirs. Newspapers covering the event noted both the spectacle, Gladys's gown, her jewels, the elaborate floral arrangements on the table, and the careful orchestration of every detail. The seating that positioned them, visibly but not obtrusively, the timing of their arrival to maximize the audience of other society figures, taking tea at the same hour, the management of servants and flowers and food to create an impression of effortless elegance. This was domesticity performed in public, using the hotel's commercial spaces as stages for enacting the rituals of aristocratic private life. That same year, 1908, the New York World dubbed the plaza the home for the incurably opulent, a phrase that combined admiration with satire, acknowledging the hotel's magnificence while mocking the idea that such luxury could be a permanent condition rather than a temporary indulgence. But for the families who had already made the plaza their primary residence, the description was more accurate than satirical. This was indeed their home, and their wealth was indeed sufficient to sustain indefinite residence in one of the world's most expensive hotels. Each afternoon, according to later staff recollections and contemporary accounts, maids in quiet shoes and starched uniforms refreshed vases of lilies and roses in the residential corridors, carrying buckets of fresh water and armfuls of flowers from the hotel's basement storage areas, where daily deliveries from wholesale florists were received and processed. This daily ritual of flower replacement, so routine as to be nearly invisible, exemplified the hotel's promise that domestic beauty would be maintained without the resident needing to manage the labor, that one could wake each day to fresh flowers without ever thinking about who cut them, arranged them, delivered them, or disposed of yesterday's wilted blooms. The sensory signature of plaza residence was distinct. The rustle of silk dresses and the clink of china from the palm court drifting up elevator shafts, the scent of hothouse flowers competing with perfume and furniture polish, the particular quality of light filtered through lace curtains that looked onto Central Park's greenery rather than city streets. The temperature was reliably comfortable year-round, maintained by a massive heating plant in the basement and by the building's modern construction. The sounds were muted by thick walls and carpeting, creating an atmosphere of hushed elegance even in the midst of Manhattan's urban density. The plaza offered heiresses and wealthy widows the illusion of rootedness, a permanent address, personalized spaces, the accumulation of domestic routine and habit, combined with the flexibility of departure. One could leave for Newport or Europe simply by locking the suite door, without the complicated arrangements required to close and mothball a private house. One could expand or contract one's space by renting additional rooms or relinquishing them, something impossible in an owned residence. But before these women could successfully turn hotel suites into palaces, before they could use these commercial spaces as domestic stages, they had to learn how to inhabit such rooms correctly and how to navigate the peculiar blend of public and private that hotel residences required. Between 1870 and 1914, the period of most intense transatlantic marriage traffic, rapid industrial growth, and speculative fortunes in railways, mines, steel, and retail, produced an entire class of American heiresses whose dowries could rescue indebted European estates burdened by agricultural depression, rising taxes, and the accumulated debts of generations. Titles were traded for dollars in arrangements so common they became almost routine, reported in society columns with the same matter-of-fact tone used for business mergers. London guidebooks and advice manuals aimed at American heiresses advised newcomers to secure a respectable address, Claridge's, Brown's, or a rented Mayfair house, as the essential first step to social acceptance. The hotel, in this calculus, was not a temporary expedient but a strategic choice, offering both flexibility and instant credibility in ways that other options could not match. At the same time, the apartment hotel emerged in American cities like New York, Boston, and Baltimore as an efficient, status-laden solution for elite families seeking to reduce domestic management burdens while maintaining social position. Hotels like the Brexton in Baltimore or the Marlborough in New York promised Gilded Age splendor with minimal domestic labor. No need to hire, manage, and house large staff of servants when the hotel provided maid service, restaurants, and maintenance. The arrangement proved particularly attractive to wealthy widows, to peripatetic heiresses moving between seasons in different cities, and to families whose fortunes were sufficient for luxury but not quite sufficient for the full apparatus of traditional aristocratic household management. In this world, the hotel key became another form of credential, granted by commercial transaction rather than inheritance, displayed through behavior rather than worn as jewelry, and sometimes revoked when finances failed or scandal erupted. The hotel was simultaneously more democratic than the aristocratic estate. Anyone with money could rent a suite, and more precarious. The money had to continue. The bills had to be paid. The performance of appropriate wealth had to be sustained. By the late 1880s and early 1890s, American debutantes arriving in London's Mayfair district for the social season were given explicit guidance, codified in etiquette manuals and advice books about transatlantic marriage, to establish themselves first at one of the respectable hotels. Claridge's on Brook Street, or Brown's Hotel on Albemarle Street, or perhaps in a rented but architecturally impressive house if family connections could secure one. The hotel choice mattered enormously. Claridge's and Brown's catered specifically to the aristocratic and wealthy, maintaining standards of service and decorum that signaled one's seriousness about entering elite society. A cheaper or less fashionable hotel would mark one as ignorant of social codes, or worse, as someone trying to economize. A fatal impression for an heiress whose primary selling point was access to unlimited American money. For young women like Mary Leader, the Chicago-born heiress who had married George Curzon and become Vicereine of India, the hotel lobby and suite served as both waiting room and classroom during her first London seasons in the early 1890s. Hotel registers, preserved correspondence, and memoir accounts describe mornings structured around the receiving of calling cards in hotel sitting rooms, with Mary and her chaperone, her mother or a hired companion, practicing the calibrated choreography that English society demanded, rising precisely when a visitor was announced, offering a hand at exactly the right moment and angle, making conversation that was engaged but not too eager, and ringing for tea at the appropriate interval. The physical environment shaped the performance. Light filtered through lace curtains onto small tables, inevitably crowded with fresh flowers, roses, or lilies, depending on season and availability. Stiff formal place cards indicating seating arrangements even for intimate gatherings, and growing piles of invitation cards requiring responses. A hotel suite furnished by the management in a generic approximation of aristocratic taste but overlaid with personal touches. Family silver placed strategically on side tables, monogrammed stationery arranged on the writing desk, photographs in silver frames, became the first rehearsal space for the role of future chatelaine of a great country house. The hotel setting had specific advantages for this kind of training. Unlike a private house, the hotel could be abandoned quickly if things went wrong. If a scandal erupted, if a courtship failed, if a family needed to retreat, the financial commitment was significant but not permanent, one paid by the week or month rather than purchasing property. And the hotel staff, experienced in serving the international wealthy, could coach American visitors in English customs, could warn of social mistakes before they happened, could provide the kind of practical intelligence that family connections might not offer. Before some heiresses ever saw the country houses they were meant to rescue through marriage, the crumbling estates, the damp bedrooms, the inadequate heating and primitive plumbing that characterized even grand English houses in this period. They learned to play their parts in rented hotel rooms that offered a sanitized, manageable version of aristocratic life. The tea service was always perfect, the flowers always fresh, the discomforts of an actual English country house living nowhere in evidence. It was training, yes, but training in an idealized version that bore only partial resemblance to the reality they would eventually face. On a spring afternoon in 1900, in a private parlor at Brown's Hotel on Albemarle Street in Mayfair, a British lady-in-waiting accompanying a duchess noted with approval the precision with which a young American woman, name unrecorded in the surviving account, but likely one of the many heiresses cycling through London seasons at the turn of the century, had been taught to pour tea. The cup was filled to exactly the right level, never so full that it might spill when lifted, but never so empty as to suggest stinginess. The wrist remained steady despite the weight of the silver teapot. The conversation flowed lightly but never emptily, touching on topics that were safe, the weather, mutual acquaintances, upcoming social events, while avoiding those that were forbidden, politics, religion, anything too personal or intense. Etiquette handbooks from the period devoted entire chapters, sometimes dozens of pages, to the proper conduct of afternoon tea, emphasizing that the hostess must manage multiple simultaneous demands, orchestrating introductions between guests who might be strangers, navigating rivalries and feuds that required careful separation of certain individuals, maintaining conversational momentum, and timing the service of food so that guests were neither rushed nor made to wait awkwardly. The apparent simplicity of the tea ritual, just pouring hot water over leaves after all, concealed extraordinary complexity. For American heiresses in London hotels, tea service mastery was essential social technology. The afternoon tea, occurring daily between 4 and 6 in the afternoon, was when calling cards were exchanged, when introductions to eligible men might occur, when social connections were forged or broken. A woman who could not manage tea properly, who overfilled cups, or forgot to offer milk and sugar, or allowed awkward silences to develop, marked herself as socially incompetent, unready for the demands of running a country house where entertaining was constant and expectations were unforgiving. Behind the scenes, hotel staff received and executed standing orders that revealed the strategic thinking underlying these apparently casual afternoon gatherings. Surviving bills and correspondence from hotels like Brown's and Claridge's show charges for fresh flowers in specific colors. White roses for one client, pink carnations for another, detailed specifications for pastry assortments, more substantial offerings for gatherings likely to include men, lighter fare for exclusively female company, and exact seating plans communicated on monogrammed hotel stationery. The hotel, in effect, became a commercial partner in the Heiresses' social campaign, providing the infrastructure and expertise that made elaborate entertaining possible without the overhead of a private establishment. In some surviving hotel bills from this era, floral charges rival or exceed food costs, proof that arranging flowers was not merely decorative but strategic. The right flowers sent messages. Roses suggested romance or serious courtship. Lilies implied purity and high status. Orchids announced wealth substantial enough to afford the most expensive blooms. Color mattered too. White was safe and elegant. Pink suggested femininity. Red was too bold for unmarried women. An American heiress learning these codes in a London hotel was acquiring a vocabulary of nonverbal communication, as important as learning to speak French or play the piano. The hotel tea tray, carried into a private sitting room by uniformed staff, might appear to be simply a domestic amenity, a convenience provided for guests' comfort. In practice, for the heiresses who used these spaces, it functioned as a portable council table where alliances were negotiated, where marriageability was assessed, where futures were determined over cucumber sandwiches and Earl Grey. The same skills that allowed one to navigate afternoon tea at Brown's Hotel would later be deployed at Blenheim Palace or Chatsworth or any of the other great houses where American money was rescuing aristocratic lineages. But the hotel was where the training occurred, where mistakes could be made in relative privacy, where one could practice before the stakes became irreversible. By 1909, the Palm Court at the Plaza Hotel in New York routinely exceeded its posted capacity of 350 persons during the peak afternoon hours, filled with society women and their daughters creating a scene that combined the functions of social club, marriage market, and theatrical performance under a soaring canopy of potted palms and an elaborate stained glass ceiling that bathed the space in soft-colored light. The acoustic environment was distinctive. The clink of china cups on saucers, the rustle of silk and taffeta as women moved between tables, the muted sound of a small orchestra playing Viennese waltzes and light classical selections, all blending into a gentle wall of sound that permitted private conversation while creating an atmosphere of refined sociability. In this carefully designed space, acoustically engineered to be soft enough for intimacy, but not so quiet that silence would be awkward, visually dazzling with its marble and bronze and elaborate ceiling, but not so overwhelming as to make the occupants feel small. Young American women observed how their elders managed the complex social dynamics that played out daily. Who sat where mattered enormously. The best tables with optimal views and convenient access were claimed by the most socially prominent families through a combination of tipping, advance reservation, and sheer force of habit. The same table every afternoon at the same hour, held regardless of whether the family actually appeared. Lesser families accepted less desirable positions or came at off-peak hours, or simply took what they could get. Newspaper society columns from this period mention specific afternoons when recently engaged American heiresses or those newly arrived from extended stays in Europe became informal spectacles at the Palm Court. The act of entering the space, crossing from the entrance to one's table, a distance of perhaps 50 feet, but traversed under the observation of hundreds of eyes, pausing to greet acquaintances with exactly calibrated warmth, friendly but not familiar, acknowledging but not effusive, and settling at the table with apparent ease while managing heavy skirts, cumbersome hats, and the small reticules that contained essential accessories. All of this constituted a kind of public examination. The flora changed with seasons and occasions, roses and lilies in spring, dahlias in autumn, forced bulbs in winter, but the presentation remained consistently lavish. Centerpieces on each table, massive arrangements on side tables and in alcoves, garlands wound around columns, the whole space continuously refreshed so that no wilting was visible, no brown edges on petals, nothing to suggest mortality or decay. The effect was one of perpetual spring, of nature tamed and perfected and placed in service of social ritual. For young women learning to navigate elite New York society, the Palm Court functioned as a kind of public classroom where lessons were delivered not through explicit instruction, but through observation and imitation. They watched how established hostesses signaled to waiters without appearing to do so, how they managed the arrival of additional guests at a full table, and how they handled the departure of those who had stayed too long. They observed who spoke to whom and who carefully avoided eye contact with whom, learning to read the subtle indicators of alliance and enmity that structured this world. The hotel's decor could be and was altered seasonally, different floral schemes, different music programs, different menu offerings, but the unwritten code governing who sat where, who was greeted, and who was carefully not noticed, who belonged, and who was aspirational, shifted much more slowly. These codes were not written in any manual, could not be taught explicitly, had to be absorbed through sustained observation and careful attention to minute social signals. The Palm Court taught that in hotel life, as in country houses and aristocratic estates, physical space itself could be wielded as power, that the ability to command the best table, to fill it with the right guests, to orchestrate tea as though it were a diplomatic reception, marked one as successful in the competitive game of Gilded Age social positioning. On a foggy November morning in 1910, a long-term resident at a residential hotel just off Fifth Avenue, possibly the Gotham or the Savoy, both catering to precisely this clientele, recorded in her private diary the elaborate schedule that structured her daughter's days entirely within the hotel's walls. French with Mademoiselle at 9 o'clock in the small parlor, piano with Professor Heinemann at 10 in the music salon on the third floor, posture and deportment exercises after luncheon under Mrs. Crawford's supervision, while the world comes to the door instead of us going to them. The entry captures a phenomenon that had become increasingly common. Residential hotels, with their public dining rooms, private music salons, and reading rooms, allowed ambitious mothers to curate their daughters' social and educational development without the considerable overhead of maintaining a fully staffed private mansion. The hotel became, in effect, a vertical finishing school, with different floors and rooms serving different pedagogical functions, with professional instructors and visiting masters entering through service corridors to avoid the social spaces where residents might encounter them casually. Governesses teaching French and German, music masters providing piano and voice instruction, dancing teachers drilling students in the latest ballroom techniques, deportment specialists correcting posture and teaching the precise angles and durations of curtsies for different ranks of nobility. All of these educational professionals adapted their practices to the hotel environment. They carried portable teaching materials, scheduled sessions in the hotel's semi-public rooms, and learned to work within the constraints of spaces designed for leisure rather than instruction. Suitors and chaperones, by contrast, were received in the family's private drawing rooms or in the hotel's public reception spaces, areas carefully chosen for their ability to display wealth and taste while maintaining propriety. The furniture in these spaces was strategically arranged. chairs positioned to allow conversation but maintain appropriate physical distance, fresh flowers placed to add color and demonstrate that money was no object, fresh flowers daily being a reliable indicator of wealth, lighting adjusted to be flattering, but not so dim as to suggest impropriety. The daughter's world in such arrangements narrowed to a highly controlled sequence of polished surfaces. The carpeted corridor from suite to elevator, the elevator's brass and mirror interior, the hotel's various parlors and salons, perhaps the palm court for carefully supervised afternoon tea. Outside, New York City underwent dramatic transformation in these years. Subways being built, skyscrapers rising, waves of immigration changing neighborhoods. But inside the hotel, the routines remained remarkably stable, deliberately insulated from the city's churning change. The sensory environment was carefully controlled as well. Noise from the street was muffled by heavy curtains and solid construction. Temperature was maintained by modern heating systems. Light was softened by lace curtains and silk lampshades. Everything was designed to create an atmosphere of refined, cushioned calm, a bubble of privilege floating above the urban tumult. For daughters raised almost entirely within this environment, the hotel became their known world, the standard against which all other spaces would be measured and often found wanting. One such daughter, decades later in an unpublished memoir fragment held in a private archive, recalled this period with ambivalence. We lived at the hotel for 3 seasons while Mother negotiated my debut and sought suitable introductions. I learned to navigate its corridors in darkness, knew every gilt mirror and marble column, but could not have told you the names of streets beyond our block. The hotel was our entire world, safe, beautiful, and utterly artificial. I was being prepared for a life in great houses, but I wonder now if I learned the wrong lessons. I learned how to live where servants were invisible, and everything was perpetually perfect. No one taught me what to do when the money ran out, when staff couldn't be paid, when the silver needed polishing, and there was no one to polish it. The quote reveals the fundamental limitation of hotel-based education. It prepared young women for a world of sustained, effortless luxury that was already becoming unsustainable, even as they were being trained for it. The skills acquired, the ability to live gracefully in beautiful spaces, to entertain elegantly, to maintain appropriate social distance from servants while depending utterly on their labor. These skills assumed continuation of wealth and social systems that were, in fact, beginning to crack. By 1912, architects' plans and hotel management records show an increasing phenomenon at the Plaza and other luxury New York hotels. Suites being combined, walls being removed, 2, 3, sometimes 4 adjacent units knocked together to create sprawling multi-room apartments that rivaled or exceeded the scale of substantial townhouses. Investors and industrialists like John Bet-A-Million Gates, so called for his legendary gambling habits, occupied entire floors, transforming hotel residences into something approaching a private palace within a commercial building. Wealthy female relatives, widows, unmarried heiresses, divorced women followed this pattern, insisting on sufficient space not just for living but for entertaining on a scale that had previously required ownership of a mansion. The architectural modifications were substantial and expensive. Load-bearing walls could not be removed, but partition walls could be, creating large reception rooms and dining rooms suitable for formal entertainments. Custom furnishings were commissioned, built-in bookcases and cabinets, elaborate marble mantels imported from Europe, silk wall coverings in patterns chosen by the residents, decorative plaster work on ceilings, crystal chandeliers that had to be specially supported by reinforced ceiling structures. All of this customization was paid for by the residents but remained with the building. It was not portable, could not be taken when leases ended. Behind the glamorous surface, hotel managers faced growing concerns about the financial and practical implications of these arrangements. Combining suites reduced the building's flexibility. 4 smaller suites that could be rented separately to 4 different families became one large apartment rented to a single family, reducing both total revenue and options for reconfiguration if that tenant left. The lavish customizations, while paid for initially by residents, created future problems. The next tenant might not want silk wall coverings in those particular colors, might prefer different room arrangements, might find the highly personalized spaces unsuitable for their needs. Hotel ledgers from this period, where they survive in archives, reveal the financial structure of these arrangements in granular detail. Beyond base rent, which could run to hundreds or even thousands of dollars monthly, there were charges for daily fresh flowers, different arrangements for different rooms, changed seasonally, special kitchen services, private dinners prepared by hotel chefs but served in resident suites, laundry and linen, items provided by the hotel but in quantities and qualities exceeding standard offerings, and seasonal redecorations, changing curtains, slipcovers, and decorative elements for spring versus winter versus fall. Florists' accounts are particularly revealing. One plaza resident's bills from 1913 showed daily deliveries, roses for the main drawing room, lilies for the entrance hall, orchids for the dining table, smaller arrangements for bedrooms and powder rooms, special orders for entertainments. The annual flower budget for this single family exceeded what a skilled tradesman might earn in a decade. The bills accumulate line by line, week by week, creating totals that seem almost incomprehensible. Thousands of dollars annually just for cut flowers that would last at most a few days before being replaced. For heiresses and wealthy widows with substantial independent incomes, from trust funds, from inheritances, from settlements negotiated in marriage or divorce, these costs seemed manageable, even trivial. The stock market had been generally rising, dividends were reliable. The Gilded Age assumption that wealth would perpetually increase had not yet been seriously challenged, but the system was more fragile than it appeared. Income that seemed permanent could be disrupted by market crashes, by changes in corporate management, by legal challenges to trusts and estates. Some of the customization expenses were immediately visible in the luxurious results. Others were hidden in the building's infrastructure. Upgraded electrical service to handle additional chandeliers and appliances, reinforced floors to bear the weight of grand pianos and heavy furniture, enhanced soundproofing between suites to provide privacy. All of these improvements were charged to residents who wanted them but became permanent building features that would serve future occupants long after the original families had departed. Turning a room key into a long-term claim on substantial space meant accepting that the building, not the family, would ultimately own these improvements and accumulations. Unlike a privately owned mansion that could be sold and whose value might include the decorative improvements, hotel customizations were essentially gifts to the building owner, creating beauty and comfort that enhanced the resident's experience but could not be recovered financially. The moment when these improvements outpaced both family incomes and public tolerance for such displays of wealth was approaching, though few recognized it yet. During the London social seasons of the 1890s and early 1900s, guidebooks and advice manuals aimed at American families seeking titled marriages for their daughters emphasized repeatedly that success required not only substantial dowries and fashionable gowns, but the right base of operations from which to launch the campaign. Claridge's or Brown's Hotel appears as a refrain in these texts, the hotel choice serving as immediate proof of seriousness, resources, and understanding of British social codes. An American family arriving and staying at a lesser hotel or attempting to economize by renting unfashionable lodgings signaled either ignorance or insufficient wealth, both fatal to matrimonial ambitions. Matchmakers like Minnie Stevens Paget, herself American-born, daughter of Perrin Stevens, who had made his fortune in the hotel business in America, used these prestigious hotels as headquarters for arranging alliances between American money and British titles. Her position was unique. As an American who had successfully married into British society, her husband, Arthur Paget, was the younger son of a marquis. She understood both worlds, could translate between different social codes, and had the connections necessary to make introductions that would have been impossible for newcomers to arrange themselves. Mrs. Paget's operation, described in contemporary accounts and later biographical studies, combined social finesse with business acumen. She maintained semi-permanent residence at Claridge's during the London season, using the hotel's public rooms for carefully orchestrated chance encounters between eligible American heiresses and impoverished British aristocrats. The hotel setting offered crucial advantages. It was neutral territory, neither the American nor British family's home. It provided privacy for negotiations while offering public spaces for initial meetings, and it lent an air of propriety to what were, underneath the social niceties, fundamentally commercial transactions. Marriage settlements preserved in legal archives and family papers reveal the brutal arithmetic of these alliances. Typical agreements involved American fortunes measured in hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars, sometimes paid as lump sums, sometimes as annual incomes guaranteed for the bride's lifetime, sometimes as complex combinations of capital transfers and income streams. These sums were committed to restoring crumbling English estates, repairing roofs, modernizing plumbing, paying off accumulated debts, restoring agricultural operations, maintaining the staff and lifestyle necessary to sustain an aristocratic household. In return, the British aristocrat provided title, rank, social position, and access to circles that no amount of American money alone could penetrate. The bride became a duchess, or a countess, or a lady, gained precedence at court, acquired the right to wear certain insignia and appear in certain spaces, became part of a genealogy extending back centuries. For families like the Vanderbilts, still stung by their exclusion from old New York society despite their vast wealth, these European titles offered validation, a different kind of social currency that trumped American wealth hierarchies. The social events surrounding these negotiations often spilled from private hotel suites into the hotel's public ballrooms and reception rooms, blurring the line between personal celebration and commercial display. An engagement party at Claridge's or Brown's served multiple purposes. It announced the alliance. It demonstrated the American family's resources. It provided British society an opportunity to inspect and evaluate the bride, and it gave the hotel valuable publicity as the site of glamorous aristocratic American unions. But the hotel's setting also revealed the fundamental character of these arrangements. They were transactions conducted in commercial spaces, alliances negotiated in buildings owned by neither party, ceremonies staged in rented rooms. The contrast with traditional aristocratic marriages, conducted in ancestral estates, sealed in family chapels, rooted in specific places that families had occupied for generations, could not have been more stark. For some heiresses, hotels served as launch pads rather than destinations, temporary bases from which they were transplanted to ancestral estates, where they would spend the rest of their lives. Others, however, attempted to reverse the direction of the metaphor. Instead of leaving the hotel for a palace, they tried to transform the hotel itself into a palace, to make permanent residence in commercial spaces function as an aristocratic establishment. In the 1910s, New York society columns and magazine profiles occasionally featured women who had lived for years, sometimes decades, in hotel suites, surrounding themselves with personal servants who supplemented the hotel's staff, and entertaining as if in privately owned houses despite the commercial nature of their residences. At the Plaza, long-term residents commissioned prominent decorators to install custom paneling that replicated 18th century French interiors, commissioned mirrors that covered entire walls to create illusions of expanded space, and hung crystal chandeliers that required special structural reinforcement and whose installation costs alone exceeded what many families earned annually. At other residential hotels throughout Manhattan, the St. Regis, the Sherry Netherland, the Pierre, as it opened in the 1930s, similar patterns emerged. Architects were brought in to design suites with formal enfilades suitable for receiving lines during large entertainments, to create music rooms with proper acoustics for chamber concerts, to build libraries with floor-to-ceiling, built-in shelving that gave the impression of generations of accumulated leather-bound volumes even when the books had been purchased wholesale from dealers. These long-term hotel residents developed elaborate social rituals that mimicked those of private households. They had days when they received callers, specific afternoons each week when their doors were open to visitors, when calling cards were left and tea was served, when the social machinery of elite life operated exactly as it would in a Fifth Avenue mansion. They employed private social secretaries to manage correspondence and invitations, private maids and valets to supplement hotel staff, sometimes even private chefs who worked in the hotel's kitchens to prepare meals according to family preferences. The economic logic seemed sound. Why purchase and maintain an expensive mansion that would be occupied for only part of the year, that required year-round staff even when empty, that demanded constant repairs and updates? The hotel offered flexibility, comprehensive service, and freedom from the burdens of property ownership. But this logic depended on several assumptions: that income would continue indefinitely, that the hotel would remain stable and welcoming, that society would continue to accept hotel residents as legitimate rather than as evidence of rootlessness or decline. Yet social commentary grew increasingly sharp about what was derisively called hotel aristocracy. Satirists and progressive journalists mocked the pretensions of women who tried to establish courts in rented rooms, who attempted to create the appearance of hereditary privilege while living in fundamentally commercial spaces. The criticism operated on multiple levels. It questioned the authenticity of their social position. It highlighted the contradiction between aristocratic pretensions and commercial reality, and it pointed to the moral implications of such displays in a city where poverty and inequality were increasingly visible and increasingly contested. After the 1897 Bradley-Martin ball and its aftermath, the public outrage, the increased property taxes, the family's retreat to permanent European exile, critics had already established a connection between hotel extravagance and indifference to urban poverty. Later, progressive journalists, in publications like McClure's and The Survey, contrasted photographs of gilded hotel lobbies with images of nearby tenements, using visual juxtaposition to make arguments about inequality and social responsibility that words alone could not convey. The idea of turning hotels into permanent palaces, which had seemed innovative and even democratizing in the 1890s, anyone with money could rent a palace, not just those born to them, began to look less like social progress and more like evasion of responsibility. A palace that could be abandoned simply by signing a check, by walking away from a lease, lacked the rooted commitment that traditional land ownership required. There was no noblesse oblige when nobility was rented by the month, no sense of obligation to tenants or community when one's only relationship to place was commercial. The transformation of hotel suites into pseudo-palaces revealed a fundamental tension in Gilded Age American society. The desire for aristocratic status combined with resistance to aristocratic obligations, the wish to live like nobility without the hereditary responsibilities that European aristocrats, theoretically, bore toward their estates and dependents. A palace that could be left with a signed check was easier to acquire than one built on family land over generations, and it proved easier for the public to resent, easier to condemn as inauthentic, easier to see as another example of wealth without responsibility, privilege without accountability. The First World War, beginning in 1914, disrupted the transatlantic marriage market that had sustained much of the social world surrounding luxury hotels. European aristocrats were called to military service. Estates were requisitioned for wartime use. The season in London was canceled or drastically reduced, and the whole machinery of introducing American heiresses to titled men ground to a halt. New income taxes, the federal income tax instituted in 1913 and increased dramatically during the war, and changing investment returns began undermining many Gilded Age fortunes that had seemed unassailable. By the 1920s, hotels like the Plaza still hosted glamorous long-term residents, but the economics had shifted significantly. Hotel managers depended increasingly on a narrower demographic: wealthy widows whose husbands had left substantial trusts, women whose incomes, while reduced from Gilded Age levels, remained sufficient for sustained luxury hotel residence. Contemporary magazine accounts describe these widows as a tourist attraction in their own right, living embodiments of a passing social order that visitors came to observe much as they might visit a museum. The widows maintained elaborate routines that preserved pre-war social forms, even as the world around them changed dramatically. They still dressed formally for dinner in the hotel restaurant, still received callers on designated afternoons, still had fresh flowers delivered daily to their suites. They inhabited an increasingly anachronistic bubble, performing rituals that had lost most of their original social function, but persisted through sheer force of habit and the availability of money to sustain them. Some former heiresses, now separated or widowed from their titled European husbands, retreated to smaller hotel suites in New York or other American cities, their circumstances dramatically reduced from the grandeur of their earlier lives. Surviving correspondence and legal documents reveal these individual trajectories. Jewelry sold piece by piece to pay hotel bills, artwork consigned to auction houses to raise cash, staff reduced from private maids and secretaries to dependents on hotel service alone, and sometimes suites downsized from sprawling multi-room apartments to more modest quarters as resources dwindled. Others left hotel life entirely, unable to sustain the expense or unwilling to continue the performance in reduced circumstances. Their elaborately customized suites were reclaimed by hotel management, divided once more into smaller units, stripped of personal touches, returned to the hotel's standard inventory. The silk wall coverings were painted over or removed. The custom built-ins were torn out or adapted for new uses. The elaborate chandeliers were sometimes sold or moved to public spaces. The whole apparatus of personalized luxury dismantled and dispersed. Renovations in the mid-20th century, as hotels adapted to changing markets and different clientele, stripped out many remaining custom features from the Gilded Age and Edwardian eras. Only fragments survived: a mirrored door in a service corridor that once led to a private suite, an oversized salon with unusually high ceilings and elaborate plasterwork that hinted at grander original purposes, a bell system for summoning servants that no longer functioned but remained embedded in walls, architectural ghosts of a vanished way of life. The 1929 stock market crash and ensuing Great Depression delivered final blows to many of the fortunes that had sustained hotel palace life. Trust funds that had seemed perpetual proved vulnerable to market collapse. Companies that had paid reliable dividends failed. Investments that had funded hotel residences for decades suddenly vanished. The dream of the hotel as a permanent palace had not disappeared entirely. There would always be some wealthy individuals maintaining long-term hotel residences, but the fortunes capable of sustaining such arrangements, and more importantly the social world that gave them meaning, had thinned dramatically. What remained was not so much power as memory embedded in architecture and routine. The hotels themselves survived by adapting, by finding new markets and new purposes for spaces originally designed for Gilded Age aristocratic fantasies. Suites that had housed heiresses became corporate apartments. Hotel ballrooms that had hosted elaborate society entertainments became conference centers and wedding venues. Public rooms designed for afternoon tea and social display adapted to serve tourists and business travelers. The buildings endured by becoming more flexible, more commercial, less tied to specific social rituals and expectations. The families who had tried to make these spaces permanent palaces, by contrast, had been unable to achieve the same adaptability. By the 1930s and 1940s, long-term female residents at the Plaza and similar luxury hotels represented a more diverse, more theatrical, less purely dynastic version of hotel life than their Gilded Age predecessors had embodied. Some were indeed heiresses or wealthy widows continuing earlier patterns, but others were entertainers, writers, and cultural figures like Kay Thompson, the singer, actress, and author who lived at the Plaza for years and whose Eloise books, published in the 1950s, drew on that experience to create a fictional child living permanent hotel life. Journalists and magazine writers describing these mid-century hotel residents used language that emphasized performance and theatricality. Suites were called floating worlds, spaces that existed somewhat outside normal social geography, filled with idiosyncratic collections that reflected their occupants' personalities, rather than any consistent standard of aristocratic taste. theatrical costumes mixed with antique furniture, manuscripts and typewriters alongside inherited silver, dogs and parrots that would have been impossible in conventional households, an atmosphere more bohemian than the rigidly controlled palatial experiments of earlier decades. Hotel archives show leases renewed year after year by the same individuals, creating a kind of permanent transience, a sustained temporariness that became its own form of stability. The residents might change their suites' decorations seasonally, might rearrange furniture to accommodate different projects and moods, but they remained anchored to the hotel as home base even as they traveled or worked elsewhere. Meanwhile, the hotel's public rooms shifted functions in response to changing markets and social patterns. Ballrooms that had hosted elaborate society entertainments in the 1890s and 1900s became nightclubs in the 1920s and 1930s, then reverted to more flexible event spaces that could accommodate everything from corporate meetings to bar mitzvahs to fashion shows. The Plaza's Persian Room became a famous nightclub venue, while the Palm Court continued serving afternoon tea but increasingly to tourists rather than to society matrons. The floral arrangements persisted throughout these transformations, but their meaning and purpose shifted. Where once individual wealthy families had ordered specific flowers in specific colors as part of strategic social performance, now floral design became part of corporate hotel branding, managed by professional decorators according to seasonal themes and hotel marketing strategies rather than personal preference. The massive arrangements still appeared in lobbies and public rooms, still changed seasonally, still announced luxury and careful maintenance, but they served tourism and corporate image rather than facilitating individual social ambitions. Photographs from mid-century hotel promotional materials show the continuity of visual forms, gilded lobbies, elaborate floral displays, elegant women in beautiful spaces, even as the underlying social and economic functions had transformed completely. Where mothers had once arranged roses to signal alliances and orchestrate marriages, professional floral designers now stage centerpieces for tourist photographs and corporate events. The aesthetic maintained but emptied of its original strategic content. In the end, it was the hotels rather than the heiresses that learned to survive by continually reinventing glamour for new audiences and new purposes. The buildings adapted by becoming more commercially flexible, by serving wider markets, by finding new uses for spaces originally designed for very specific rituals of Gilded Age society. The women who had tried to establish permanent courts in these commercial spaces had been, in most cases, unable to achieve similar adaptability. Their social world had been too rigid, too dependent on specific economic conditions and social structures that proved far more fragile than the physical buildings. Yet in quiet corners of these hotels, fragments of the earlier ambitions still wait to be discovered and interpreted. Architectural historians and hotel archivists occasionally find remnants, a service corridor that once connected combined suites, a bell system for summoning florists and maids, custom built-ins that survive behind later renovations, documentary evidence of how these spaces once functioned. These fragments testify to a moment when American wealth attempted to create instant aristocracy through the medium of hotel residence, when commercial space was repurposed as a palace, when the transient was performed as permanent, in a preserved corridor on an upper residential floor of a pre-war New York hotel, possibly the Plaza, possibly the St. Regis, possibly one of the other grand hotels from that era. A historian conducting research for a book on Gilded Age architecture opens a built-in cupboard during a building survey and discovers, behind newer plaster hastily installed during some mid-century renovation, remnants of older decor that tell stories the renovation tried to erase. There is a section of silk wall covering, faded now from whatever rich color it once displayed, the fabric brittle with age but still showing the elaborate pattern of roses and vines that must have cost extraordinary amounts when first installed. There is a brass bell push, green with patina, labeled in flowing script flowers, a dedicated system for summoning hotel staff specifically to refresh floral arrangements, suggesting that flowers were changed frequently enough to require their own service infrastructure separate from general housekeeping. There is a narrow door, perhaps 3 feet high, leading nowhere now but once providing direct access from the service corridors, allowing florists to enter suites to refresh arrangements without passing through the main rooms, maintaining the illusion that flowers simply appeared, perfectly fresh, without visible human intervention. The architectural historian examines floor plans from the building's archive, documents carefully preserved in acid-free folders in the hotel's basement storage. These drawings, dated to around 1910, reveal that this particular corridor once connected a cluster of 4 adjacent suites that had been combined into a single sprawling apartment occupying nearly an entire floor. The plans show elaborate interior modifications, walls removed to create a grand salon, a formal dining room designed to seat 24, a library with custom built-in shelving, multiple bedrooms each with attached dressing rooms and private baths, a morning room positioned to catch eastern light, service quarters for private staff employed by the resident family. Photographs from the same period, discovered in a storage box marked Historical 1905-1915, show these spaces filled with the furniture and decoration of Gilded Age luxury. Potted palms in massive Chinese porcelain jardinières stand in corners, their fronds creating natural screens between conversational groupings. Roses in silver vases cover every horizontal surface, side tables, the piano, the mantelpiece. Women in high-neck gowns with elaborate hairstyles pose stiffly for the camera, their posture suggesting the formal photographic sessions of the era, when exposures required holding still for several seconds. The photographs are carefully composed to suggest domestic intimacy, despite being taken in what are fundamentally hotel rooms. Personal objects, silver frame family photographs, leather-bound books, needlework in progress, are strategically placed to create the illusion of home. Today, the same corridor that once connected this grand apartment leads to half a dozen standard hotel rooms or, in some buildings, to office space rented by businesses that have nothing to do with the building's residential past. The silk wall covering is gone, except for that small remnant, painted over or replaced with commercial-grade wallpaper designed for durability rather than luxury. The elaborate bell system has been disconnected, its wiring removed during later renovations. The narrow service doors have been sealed and plastered over, their existence forgotten until an architectural survey or renovation project reveals them again. The ritual of daily flower arrangement has migrated to museum exhibitions, where photographs of heiresses in hotel sitting rooms are displayed alongside preserved artifacts. Dried corsages pressed in hotel guest books, embossed calling cards announcing afternoon teas, dance programs from hotel ballrooms, fragments of the material culture that once facilitated these performances of wealth and status. Museum curators write explanatory labels attempting to convey to 21st century visitors how this world functioned, what these objects meant, why anyone would spend thousands of dollars annually on fresh flowers for hotel rooms. The grand experiments, the attempts to turn hotels into hereditary palaces, to establish courts in commercial spaces, to create permanence through performance, failed in their original purpose. Very few families managed to sustain multi-generational hotel residences, to pass down suites the way landed families pass down estates. The commercial nature of the arrangement, the dependence on continued wealth, the absence of genuine rootedness, all proved fatal to dynastic ambitions. But the buildings themselves endured, adapted, found new purposes, and continue to serve functions their designers could not have anticipated. Whenever we see a gilded hotel lobby with its massive fresh flower arrangement, or a suite advertised as residential with its promise of permanent transience, we glimpse the same impulse that drove Gilded Age heiresses and their families. Elegance reaching for permanence in places fundamentally designed for passing through. The human desire to make even the temporary feel like home. The persistent fantasy that enough money and sufficient performance can transform rental into ownership, can make the commercial feel aristocratic, can create lasting dynasties in spaces that were never meant to last. We began with a woman in white kid gloves adjusting flowers in a hotel ballroom borrowed for a single extravagant night in February 1897. the Bradley-Martin ball that scandalized New York and demonstrated both the possibilities and the dangers of attempting to create palaces in commercial spaces. We end more than a century later with the faint outline of a brass bell marked flowers in a corridor that no longer leads to any grand drawing room, a corridor that has been subdivided and repurposed, its original function forgotten by almost everyone except architectural historians and those interested in the material traces of vanished social worlds. The white gloves have disappeared into museum collections or private archives, if they survived at all. The suites have been divided and redecorated countless times, adapted to changing markets and different needs. But the architecture still remembers, in fragments and ghosts, that some once tried to make these fundamentally transient spaces behave like ancestral palaces, tried to perform permanence in buildings designed for movement, tried to create hereditary courts in rooms rented by the month. The hotels survived by changing, by adapting to new markets and new purposes, by learning to serve tourists and business travelers and conference attendees rather than society families. The families, by contrast, did not always manage the same transformation. Their world was too rigid, too dependent on specific conditions that proved more temporary than the buildings that housed them.